Tonight, a high-stakes diplomatic push at the White House. President Donald Trump has hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and several leading European heads of government. They are racing the clock for a peace path, security guarantees, ceasefire debates, and even talk of territorial swaps have filled the headlines today. We go live in a few minutes to the Oval Office press conference as it wraps, and we'll break every development down with our panel. Stay with us. Hello there and good evening and welcome to our special debate for tonight. It's great to have you with us. And before we bring in our guests, here's the latest. U.S. President Donald Trump said on Monday that a peace agreement to end the war in Ukraine is attainable, following talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders at the White House. Trump described the day's discussions on a potential ceasefire as successful, noting that while all sides would prefer an immediate end to hostilities, he remained optimistic that an agreement could be reached to deter further aggression in Ukraine.
We could end this.
If everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat, and I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that. I know the president, I know myself, and I believe Vladimir Putin wants to see it ended. But we're going to work with Ukraine, we're going to work with everybody, and we're going to make sure that if there's peace, the peace is going to stay long-term. This is very long-term.
I think we show that we are strong people, and we supported the idea of the United States, of personally of President Trump, to stop this war, to make a diplomatic way of finishing this war, and we are ready for trilateral, as President said. This is a good signal about trilateral. I think this is very good.
Leaders from Europe met with President Donald Trump on Monday, calling for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine and praising Trump's efforts to stop fighting. The leaders of Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Finland, and the European Union accompanied Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on his Washington trip, as well as the Secretary General of NATO.
I think if we play this well, we could end this, and we have to end this. We have to stop the killing, we have to stop the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure. It is a terrible war. Let's make the best out of today and make sure that from today onwards we get this thing to an end as soon as possible.
Now we are here to work together with you on a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Stop the killing. This is really our common interest, stop the killing.
And if I look at the silver lining of where we stand right now, we found a solution in 1944, and I'm sure that we'll be able to find a solution in 2025 to end Russia's war of aggression and find and get a lasting and just peace.
We all would like to see a ceasefire, the latest from the next meeting on. I can't imagine that the next meeting would take place without a ceasefire.
With the right approach this afternoon, make real progress, particularly on the security guarantees, and your indication of security guarantees of some sort of Article 5 style guarantees fits with what we've been doing with the Coalition of the Willing, which we started some months ago, bringing countries together and showing that we were prepared to step up to the plate when it came to security.
We will talk about many important topics. The first one is security guarantees, how to be sure that it won't happen again, which is the precondition of every kind of peace. I'm happy that we will discuss about that. I'm happy that we will begin from a proposal, which is the, let's say, Article 5 model, which was Italian at the beginning.
In the same context, President Donald Trump met for about an hour at the White House on Monday with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in an accelerating effort to end a grinding war with Russia on terms acceptable to both sides. Trump said that he believes Russian President Vladimir Putin wants the Ukraine war to end ahead of a closely watched bilateral meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House.
If everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat.
And what they need to see to support an end to the war.
Well, we're going to be meeting with And I know the president. I've just had the honor of being with President Zelensky and all of the discussions that we've had. We covered a lot of territory. And I spoke indirectly with President Putin today. We're going to call President Putin right after this meeting. President Putin wants to find an answer too. And we'll see. And in a certain period of time, not very far from now, a week or 2 weeks, we're going to know whether or not we're going to solve this, or is this horrible fighting going to continue? We'll do our best to get it ended. But I believe a peace agreement at the end of all of this is something that's very attainable, and it can be done in the near future. And we will come to a resolution today, I think, on almost everything, including probably the security.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Monday he was open to holding an election in safe circumstances if the war with Russia comes to an end. During a meeting with US President Donald Trump in the Oval Office, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Parliament must remain the focus during wartime, stressing that elections cannot be held under current conditions.
We need to work in the Parliament because during the war you can't have elections, but we can do security. We need, we need a truth, yes, everywhere, the battlefield, in the sky, and the sea, to make possible for people to do democratic, open, legal elections.
And earlier, Russia's Deputy UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky said on Monday that he hoped US President Donald Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would create an opportunity for a long and lasting peace. Speaking to reporters at UN headquarters, he added that expectations were for the talks to mirror the tone of Trump's recent summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday in Alaska.
What everybody hopes from this meeting is that it will go in the same vein as a meeting with Russia, which, as President Trump himself acknowledged, open an opportunity for a long and lasting peace. And we welcome very much such a scenario. We hope that Ukrainian leadership will, instead of thinking about saving their own skin, think about their people who don't want to fight and who are ready for peace, fair, just, and long-lasting peace. That's what Russia is trying to achieve in Ukraine for many, many years.
All right, let's bring in our guest for tonight. Joining us live from California, USA is Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean of International Education and Senior International Officer from California State University. Hello there, Hamoud, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
It's always a pleasure and an honor to be with your guests.
Thank you indeed. And also from USA is Christopher Isayu, political analyst from Boston, USA. Hello there, Christopher.
Hello, Kareem. A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure indeed. And last but not least is Dr. Yvonne Ridley, a journalist, an author, a columnist, and Hollywood candidate from Scotland. Hello there, Dr. Yvonne.
Good evening.
So let me kick start the debate with you, Dr. Yvonne. So Trump called the day's talk successful and said peace is still attainable. These are optimistic words, but what price might that optimism carry, let's say?
Well, this was pure theatre brought to you by the master of bluff and bluster, Donald Trump, who's still seeking that elusive Nobel Peace Prize despite his utter failure in Gaza, which, let's face it, is where European leaders need to fix their gaze at the moment. But those of us sitting and watching this performance in the White House saw little indication that peace in Ukraine is at hand. The idea behind this latest push for peace seems to be that Ukraine will have to give up its remaining land in Donbass in exchange for some sort of security guarantee, short of NATO membership. But Ukraine is unlikely to accept that deal. And if it did, it would be in exchange for real security guarantees, meaning a US military commitment to back up Donald Trump's words. And this is something that Russia will never accept. So despite all the theatrics that we saw by Europe's leading puppet masters today, this war is likely to continue for the foreseeable future.
Mhm.
I didn't see any green shoots of hope at all.
Thank you indeed. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, would you agree with Dr. Yvonne Ridley, who is rather pessimistic and not seeing an end of this dark tunnel, although Trump says he believes Putin wants the war to end? But is Russia's goal truly peace here, or there is something else?
I agree with Ivan. It's really hard to say what is for show and what is for real results. But let's start from one point. There is today, I strongly believe, that you have a good environment for the Trump administration and Donald Trump to pursue sort of kind of settlement based on the fact that today, when you look at the polls that the PEW had just recently, just days ago, the number of Americans who believe that the United States is giving too much aid declined in March from 47% to 30% today. Another indicator that we look at is that the 30% of Americans, or those who interviewed, thought that the United States should give more weapons to the Ukraine. That number is at 51%. What this tells us is that there is a base behind President Donald Trump that wants certain kind of deals that would favor the Ukrainian, or that will help the United States and favor the Ukrainians in one way or another. But in strategic terms, there are 4 points that Trump has been pushing or has been sort of looking at in terms of his grand strategy, the big picture, if you want. And those 4 points, 2 of them require the Ukrainian approval or certain kind of concessions. The first one is what we call land concession. What we heard today in the press conference, when Zelensky was asked about certain kind of territorial concession, he did not respond. What does that mean? So that's one point. The second point that we had that the Russians are concerned about, or the Ukrainian, Trump proposal, and has always been this way, a little bit changed this weekend, which is postpone the membership of Ukraine in NATO. And that would be around 20 years. What we hear today about the security measures, there are some guarantees, but it's all sort of vague, it's not clear. The other 2 points and this big strategy require Russian approval, or sort of, it has to do with Russia. Russia opposes the idea of wants to protect its national interests, and it could do this, number one, by heavy militarization of its borders, and the second one is by freezing, having neutral zone. Those 4 points have not changed. What we've seen today, just there is a report just an hour ago or so, where President Trump announced that there will be bilateral meetings between Zelensky and President Putin. The official from Moscow, or the correspondent from Moscow, said the Russians are not on board of that, but there is a discussion or certain kind of result out of this meeting today that it's possible that will be some kind of direct negotiations, but that may not include the presidents. So, but the other wonder, and this is where Ivan put it very clearly, how much of this show? I mean, when you have so many European presidents showing up, protecting as if Zelensky, and the idea is that showing this mass support, it bodes very well for the American president, who wants to be seen as the leader, the maestro who is doing a solution all in his hand. hand. And then when we see the response of Zelensky seems to learn very much from his previous press conference when he met President Trump for the first time. He was very careful. He was very polite. He did not respond in ways that would displease the American president. And lastly, Karim, the whole declaration by the presidents, be it Macron or others, they were all fit with the paradigm that how to please Trump. So how much of this is a show and how much is real, we have to wait. Certainly what is reported, there is progress, but I don't know what that progress means.
Thank you indeed. And let me just bring Mr. Christopher Isayo to the debate here. Mr. Christopher, so we see maybe of the future scenarios that we're talking about or we have read in the headlines is the elections in Ukraine. So Zelensky stresses here safety first. Elections only under secure conditions. So what at stake, one might ask, for the Ukrainian democracy here?
Well, first of all, if you just think of it, if you think of it in terms of Ukraine as this faraway place that's, some mystical kind of a mystery, then it's kind of hard to envision what an election under this kind of a horrible bombardment and war would look like. So if you think about it in one of your own countries or in the United States or, overseas in the UK, imagine if this was during, for example, in the United Kingdom, imagine if elections were held by Winston Churchill during the Blitz on London when the Nazis were dropping bombs on a daily basis. Essentially, if people can't get out of the bomb shelter to vote, then how can there be an election? So democratically, the Constitution of Ukraine is quite clear, and it's pretty well in line with what we'd assume from most Western democracies, is that under a time of warfare and under a time of martial law, where there is conscription and curfews, you cannot have an election for obvious reasons. That's one big problem. The second big problem of why pushing an election before at least a ceasefire is that obviously most of the men are at the front fighting. There's also 10 million Ukrainians displaced right now throughout the world. So just given those factors alone, how could you really have a serious talk of an election? Now, I think that President Zelensky, to his credit, was very clear today and very forceful when asked the question in the very good, press conference that was a real success compared to the one on February 28th on all sides. President Zelensky was quite clear in saying that, yes, I will have an election. I don't think that President Zelensky is an obstruction to democracy from the perspective of not wanting to have an election, but clearly all the factors in terms of the safety of the people have to be there, and I think that's what he was talking about.
But which scenario would most satisfy Ukraine's international supporters, and which, would most alarm them, Mr. Christopher?
Sure, I think what would be most satisfactory to, I would say, maybe the United States backers is to see obviously, free and fair elections held. And I don't see that as that wouldn't happen. President Zelensky was elected in a lawful and free and fair election in 2019, actually as a candidate for peace. He actually campaigned on a platform of peace, of wanting to implement the failed and stalled Minsk Accords, which were also unfair to Ukraine and favored Russia. So I don't think that I think that they would like to see that. I think that they want to see that there's a chance for not a stagnation of government and not some kind of Zelensky sitting there longer than he should. But I think that would reassure people. Also, I think the recent thing that happened with the President Zelensky did have a little bit of overreach in terms of he passed laws that put some controls of the government over the anti-corruption agencies. There was a popular uprising of civil society, which is a very normal, common thing in Ukraine that happened in the Orange Revolution. It also happened in 2014. So he reacted very quickly and very quickly rolled back the unwise decision to try and curtail those independent anti-corruption agencies. And we know that very much is very important for the West and backers of Ukraine is to see that Ukraine is a transparent and not a corrupt country, which compared to, say, for example, Russia's not transparent and is renowned to be quite corrupt. So, but anyway, the Western backers want to see transparency and dynamic democratic movements.
And speaking of transparency, Christopher, I would like to bring Dr. Ridley to the debate. So, Dr. Yvonne, diplomacy can be either transparent and public and clear or discreet. Do you expect something clear to come up? I mean, like public agreements, clear public agreements from this summit, or maybe quiet side deals, let's say?
Well, I don't think discreet is in the vocabulary of the 45th American president. You know, the United States was once Ukraine's most important ally, supplying arms, funding, and political cover as Kiev fought sovereignty. But it was quite clear today that Donald Trump is losing interest in Ukraine. In fact, he was referring to Joe Biden's war. And the problem is Trump has no concept of what this conflict is about. And he's also made it rather clear that he would rather be playing golf than firing up a war machine. And it's obvious that he no longer seems to care about Ukraine or even understand it or want to understand it. He's not hidden his disdain at all. He's bored by Ukraine. There's no money in it for him. And his belated proposal, one of many, which was relayed by the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, was that he supports direct talks between Zelensky and Putin. And again, that sounded more like political theatre than diplomacy. And let's face it, that ship had sailed a long time ago. The body language in the White House was fascinating at the same time. It was quite clear that Zelensky was not going to make the same mistake as he did the last time, which saw his rapid exit from the White House. But similarly, the European leaders also seemed to be on their tiptoes and walking on eggshells. You know, they were they looked very wary. And but the reality is, I think it's Trump, not Zelensky, who now lacks the strength to turn this around. I just see the US is retreating from its traditional security leadership role, and it's almost handing the baton over, or the burden, to Europe. So despite the shock of the invasion in 2022, which nobody saw coming, American officials have often treated Kiev as the side to exert the pressure, and Moscow is the side that America has seemed to appease. But I mean, European leaders did push back, but it's all words. And I did have an amount of sympathy for Zelensky, because it's like a house of cards which could come crashing down around his head at any moment.
And speaking, I mean, of that house of cards that could crash on his head, Dr. Salhi, Ukraine says the ceasefire actually would cost them battlefield advantage. On the other hand, we know that Russia is opposing temporary ceasefires. Now, if Ukraine accepts the negotiations without a ceasefire, what are the immediate risks for Kiev? What are we talking about here?
I think, just very clarification, I think there are some very subtle nuances how the American or the President Trump is negotiating or is dealing with Ukraine. What we've seen on Friday is really a meeting more about bilateral relations, that concluded with the idea of, diplomatic relations will resume somehow, that there will be some kind of discussion between the two parties. That fits very well with the United States strategy, global strategy, and finding or accommodating or looking at how to counter the Chinese threat and others, another threat that the United States sees as its sort of threat to its national interests. That also fit with the pragmatic approach that President Donald Trump has used, being very realistic and upfront that this is about economic zone of influence, about the economy, and I am going to ask you to pay me back for all the money that we gave you. That sounds very, very cool and understandable, but in fact, it's well within the Chinese-American competition over the what you call them, the minerals that Ukraine has. So there is that part where the negotiation at the strategic level, it's as if the United States is negotiating with Russia on zones of influence. I'll give you Ukraine, you give me Syria, or sort of along those lines. The second point, today's negotiations and what came out of it, the United States is still following its ground strategy. And you could see this in 2 points. One, the United States is talking about comprehensive solution or comprehensive peace. That fits what the Russians have been talking, but it also meant that the United States is looking at the bigger picture, and they want sort of not to look at the roots that Ivan was talking about, but rather what benefit them. Then the Witkoff, that what he announced yesterday, that there is some kind of agreement on the issue of Article 5 of NATO. And again, the United States before was unwilling to, was telling Europeans, look, you have to pay your dues or I'm out. I'm no longer be part of defending your interests, and no longer buy the principle that an attack on one country of NATO is an attack on all of them. That was in January. Now that position changed. But also, this also understood in the context, what does Witkoff or the American president mean by accepting Title 5? More than anything, Article 5, I'm sorry. And more than anything else, Trump is on record by stating, when asked about Article 5 previously in one of the conferences, responded, it depends how you define it. So there is a framework there. What it means to the Ukraine in this big strategy, global strategy, in its national interest, is that is that we lean it towards more of an issue of settlement or a certain kind of a stalemate, but more settlement than anything else. What Ukraine has to accept in the ground design of things that are what's happening, what's on the ground, and that whether it wants to continue with this war, whether Trump will support them, it remains to be very questionable. But in the end, the bottom line for the Americans is that Ukraine has to accept the deal that is proposing. For the Ukraine, it could be a resolution it could be achieving peace, or it could be entering another phase. What's very interesting, and with this point, Karim, when the Finland or Finnish representative, I think his president, spoke, and we hear him in your broadcast earlier in the segment you had, he talked about Finland was there, and what's in the Second World War, Finland lost 10 to 12%, some 20% of its territory to the former Soviet Union. But Finland accepted that to achieve peace. And this is what the Finnish president was telling, or supposedly implying, to tell the Ukrainian president. Eventually, Ukraine, as of 2023, Finland is a member of NATO, and it was become a member of the EU for so many years now. In other words, the point here is that Ukraine, from a European representative, can follow the Finnish model, and that Finnish model will have to be based on the acceptance of the reality on the ground.
And speaking of the acceptable, let's say, guarantees on the ground here, let me get back to Mr. Christopher Isayu. So, Mr. Christopher, what would be most likely, I mean here, will the West maybe push arms and boots or offer guarantees without troop deployments? That is, how realistic can, let's say, a no-boot security here, how realistic is it, and how can it guarantee the situation not to slip into something more aggressive? I mean, would such guarantees even satisfy public opinion in European capitals, according to you?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. I think my colleague, Professor Salhi, he elucidated some very good points. I think the sort of, you have to look at the grand strategy. The Russians' theory of victory, Vladimir Putin's theory of victory, as the aggressor nation, as Russian doctrine has been going back to Tsarist times and Soviet times, is Russia looks at Ukraine as its near abroad and part of its old hegemony. Now, if you want to take a realist standpoint where the great powers have the power, then what Professor Salhi said is correct, that you have to, this is very much a Russian Kremlin sort of line it's used by other, it's been used by the United States as well, that, accepting the realities on the ground, quote unquote. However, if you start to unpack that a little bit, what are the realities on the ground? The realities on the ground for Russia are, Russia's lost over 1 million men and loses about 1,000 men every day. The realities on the ground for Russia are that although they have made incremental gains, that the rate that they're going, it would take them, some military experts from the Institute of Study of Warfare based in DC have said that it would take Russia about another 100 years to conquer all of Ukraine. Putin's goals, or maximalist goals, are still to conquer all of Ukraine. That's indisputable. However, the only thing standing between Vladimir Putin and doing that is the Ukrainian military. The guarantee so far, and the Ukrainians have, to be clear, neither the Ukrainian public or President Zelensky have never asked for foreign troops on the ground. All they've ever asked for is the weapons that they need in order to succeed. The HIMARS, right now everything's gone to drones and the Patriots. And actually, to his credit, even though the Biden tranches of military aid are winding down, President Trump has allowed the scheme whereby NATO countries, the European powers that we just saw in the room there in the Oval Office, to buy weapons for Ukraine. So the biggest guarantee, and this is something President Zelensky has said, is the Ukrainian military. So as Zelensky has said, a strong Ukrainian military that's not demilitarized or defanged as Mr. Putin would like. That's the first thing. The second, if you want to talk about a NATO-style guarantee, this is where things get a little bit trickier. This idea is not new. It's actually been floated around since President Trump took office, and Mark Rutte, the president of NATO, and the European powers and other, Americans that are the Ukrainian Russia hawks and Republicans and the Democrats have also discussed this idea whereby some type of an assistance force, maybe analogous to what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1999, whereby it was kind of like a force that would monitor the, I don't want to say a ceasefire, but would monitor some type of a peace. However, the force would have credibility by being there and being armed and being a force of NATO troops, whereby if they were attacked by Russia, it would that's a strong deterrent. However, whether or not the troops would be actually fighting Russian forces if Russia decided to reinvade or just simply step aside, that's another story. So that sort of Article 5 type guarantee becomes very tricky. If you parse it out, Article 5 for NATO members stipulates that an attack on one is an attack on all. However, where it gets tricky, even for NATO members, is that it allows each member state to respond. It compels them to respond. However, the response does not necessarily have to be immediate or military. So if you take that concept, I have some points that I can talk about later. If you're, in terms of the actual how theoretical NATO-like guarantee for Ukraine would work, but it becomes tricky, and then it becomes a question of what NATO country would want to undertake that. How much American support would be given. Very positively, President Trump has indicated, again, no details, but that's kind of how he works, that the U.S. would provide a backstop to a European assistance force. However, we know that for Russia, that's a non-starter. If you want to take Putin's maximalist goals of pacifying Ukraine or having kind of a rump state, a defanged Ukraine, he's probably not going to go for that, which is why the Russian way of negotiating is to present such difficult to achieve demands that they almost know that Ukraine, they're bound to fail. But perhaps there's still some room. Perhaps Putin has been somewhat compelled to see reality. I don't think so personally, but who knows? It's good to stay optimistic.
And just recently, we have been actually watching the live footage just earlier of Zelensky speaking to reporters outside of the White House, and he was saying that he discussed security guarantees for Ukraine with Trump and the European leaders, and that he received important signals from the US leader, meaning that he's going to be part of such guarantees. He also said Ukraine is ready for any format to meet Putin, and he added that the results of the talks was good, normal, end quote. So here, Dr. Ridley, if European leaders insist on a ceasefire and Trump says we can still negotiate during fighting, who is mostly likely to bend here, what is going to be the concession? Is it going to come from Europe, the US, or Ukraine here?
Well, Christopher touched on the elephant in the living room, which is the amount of manpower that Ukraine needs to have any sort of fight back. Russia at the moment is sensing maybe not a victory, but certainly a betting person would put their money on the Russian side, which is exploiting Ukraine's manpower shortage. And no amount of Western support can sort this out unless America or Europe put soldiers on the ground. And despite all their grand talks and offers of arms and support and strong words, I haven't heard a single European leader or President Trump talk about helping by putting boots on the ground. In fact, President Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, had suggested that Ukraine might receive an Article 5 type of security guarantee outside of NATO. And that is, frankly, a disaster for American interests. And again, mitigated by the fact that there is no way Putin will accept that. So for Trump to talk about guarantees for Ukraine's security, it really is a high-risk business. And I do fear where this will all lead. 24 hours ago, or less than 48 hours ago, nobody had planned this summit. It's just happened. And there was such drama and theatre behind it. It lifted everyone's expectations to an unrealistic level. And here we are today. No talk of a ceasefire. The catastrophic loss of manpower that Ukraine has suffered is not being talked about. So if America and Europe are really serious about helping Zelensky, how are they going to do it? None of their commitments seem to be credible at the moment. And Trump's guarantees always sound very grand. But once the lights go out and the cameras stop turning, there's very little or no substance behind them. In fact, some analysts, defense analysts, are really concerned that they're entering into dangerous territory by creating this false sense of security for Ukraine. and I really feel for the people of Ukraine, because I think that they have continually had their expectations lifted and supported, only to be crushed in the end. So, you know, this is a very dirty war, and I don't see America or Europe coming up with a constructive solution which will please anyone.
And speaking of a constructive solution, Dr. Salhi, could Europe, according to you, alone craft something meaningful, like say meaningful guarantees for Ukraine? If Washington steps back, would maybe Europeans be prepared to pay the political and military price?
Well, the military price, Reuters just reported earlier that there is a sort of a deal, some kind of $100 billion, whereby the Ukraine will spend about $100 billion to buy, the Ukraine will buy in the amount of $100 billion in weapon to guarantee its security. And then there is another deal where it will produce, Ukraine will produce drones and other machines for $50 billion. So that sort of fits with the whole framework of all it's about money, benefits, and so on and so forth. That's what the Ukrainian, it is reported, are proposing. I think we're really, and Ivan and both Christopher hit it there, there is so much talk about the non-talk. It seems to me the best way to describe Friday's meeting and this meeting is that really we are at the stage of early negotiations. Meaning what? We are sort of throwing out their ideas out there and see what sticks. So, and it's more about negotiating, how to negotiate. This meeting could be seen as a framework, or as countries putting their sort of position out there, and because you can't tell me that for 5 hours, with especially as Ivan mentioned earlier, that this meeting last week we didn't know that would happen, but suddenly you have all these leaders showing up, and it's all sort of about making deals. But how can such deals have to take time? The other point that is very, very interesting, CNN, one of the network reported that sort of a glimpse of how these things are happening. They reported apparently President Donald Trump did not know this, but the soundbite where President Trump was heard telling French President Macron that they want to make deal with me, meaning that the Russians want to make deal with him and everybody else wants to make a deal with him. And that's really what's boiled down. I mean, you have these delegations coming here with no real plans. I mean, what does Europe want to do? The United States is very, very clear since January. The 4 point I mentioned earlier, United States has been President Donald Trump. You can say anything else about him, but he has been consistent what he wants from this in the Ukraine. You can go back and forth. There are some confusion, some vagueness, but at the end, he wants to have a deal, a strategic deal with Russia, and he wants Ukraine to give him his minerals and to accept the real fact. Those are the bottom lines. And Europeans have failed to deliver on all levels. So their roles to be constructive, they have to raise at the level accepting that security of Europe depends on them, that the collective European system, the organization of security that the Europeans have, must have tangible, real results. We've seen this at the early age, maybe 2 years ago or so, when this conflict started, where the Europeans came together, put a plan to strengthen their security, but it's not going anywhere. So the point is that the Europeans so far has shown major disappointment, and this is a clear example of how it is. We are more playing into a personality of leader who understand very well that in order to make deal, they have to come to me, and they come to him, but with no plans. What is it? I mean, talking about peace deal, talking about security guarantees, there is nothing that changed. And more than anything else, don't tell me that the Europeans are surprised by the American position. And don't tell me that when Witkoff says, I believe and we are going to accept the Article 5, that no one in the room has asked himself or herself, but what does he mean by that? Because, as I said earlier, Trump is very clear. It depends on how you define Article 5. The same thing with security guarantees. I mean, the European on many levels are continuing to play that post-World War II idea that they rely on the United States for the security, and their failure to protect Europe from this, whatever that means, is a clear indication that Europe has to live up to its standard. It's not just by showing up as herds to the United States and plea, but to present a real plan for moving forward. So I don't see any sort of positive out of this. Maybe the only positive one could do, to say, Karim, is that this is the most the European could do, and when they go back, they start thinking about concrete, real solutions.
And speaking of solutions, one of the solutions that Trump suggested, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, is discussing these possible exchanges of territory and even floated Crimea concessions in the past. Now, Mr. Christopher Isayu, from a moral and legal standpoint, how dangerous this can be? That's on the one hand. And on the other, I mean, if a deal is concluded and some territorial recognition in exchange for security guarantees happen, what safeguards should be written to prevent future aggressions?
Yeah, thanks, Karim. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, morally, in an ideal world, Putin is the aggressor. Maybe diplomatically, at some point. I mean, Putin's invaded Georgia. He's invaded many of his neighbors. So it's clear he's the aggressor. He's committed horrible atrocities. In a moral world, Putin would be held accountable, and reparations would be made, and Ukraine would have to not cede any territory, which it may not do anyway. In reality, how do you enforce anything against Putin if you're not willing to send troops to Moscow? NATO troops, which no one's going to do, of course. Ukraine never asked for it. If you're not willing to continue to arm Ukraine to the teeth, and you want some kind of a settlement, which, I mean, Putin is also well known for breaking. I mean, after all, it was the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that was signed by Yeltsin, Putin's predecessor, that Putin broke anyhow by invading Ukraine in 2014, when the whole war really started. So ideally, even if you want to put it in a realpolitik type of a framework whereby you're looking at kind of a Finlandization model, if you will, or even a partition like North and South Korea, then it becomes a question of what is the Ukrainian constitution allow? Well, the Ukrainian constitution is clear, whereby it cannot cede territory without the will of the people. So President Zelensky would have a hard time selling that to the domestic Ukrainian population. However, some polls, even there was a Pew Research poll, I think, which was a little bit incorrectly done and was not analyzed quite very well, the results. However, the results were true that Ukrainians now are more willing to seek territory for peace, which makes sense because they're beleaguered and they've had enough of war. They are more willing to do that, but not at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty. So were Zelensky able to somehow cede some type of territory, then maybe some type of security guarantees, maybe some type of...
I think we're having a technical problem with you, Christopher Isayu. We don't have the sound.
Sorry,
but,
can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Let's just, because very briefly, Christopher Isayu, just finish your idea, because we're about to wrap up.
So it would be a difficult sell, but I mean, in an ideal world, maybe there could be some type of partition. What's ironic about the Finland model is Finland remained neutral for many, many years after it ceded territory to Russia. However, in 23, it became a member of NATO. So it's kind of the chicken and the egg that Ukraine sooner or later will need some type of, if you want to talk about Finland, then Ukraine will have to have some type of NATO type or NATO membership as the ultimate security guarantee against Russian aggression.
Thank you indeed. And just as a final word, briefly, Dr. Ridley, so if Kiev refuses territorial concessions, does that doom the possibility of a trilateral summit that we're talking about, and could Putin accept only symbolic concessions?
Well, even after the trilateral summit or during it, Zelensky's hands are tied because international borders cannot be changed by force. And these are decisions that will have to be ultimately taken by the people who really matter. And it isn't the puppet masters at the White House, it's the Ukrainian people. And they will have a final say about the future of their country. And whether Zelensky survives this or not remains to be seen. But Russia's strategy seems to be working. You know, out of the three of them, Putin must be sitting back and laughing at the moment, because the word ceasefire was thrown out, a lot of talk about peace, but of course the guns haven't fallen silent yet. They're still very much firing.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, and Mr. Christopher Isayu. Thank you indeed for all your insights. And with this, we come to a close to this special of tonight. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on our channel. Until next time, do take care.